I'm keeping this little hoodie just in case I get cold. It's actually for Jeremy's daughter. Jeremy and I were talking about who has the best shoes. Have you checked out Jeremy's shoes? He's not only one of the top VCs, he's also one of the best dressed VCs, I think. So
that's
incredible.
A low bar.
Oh, well, were any VCs out here? No, Jeremy, you've always, as long as I've known you, you've always dressed. I'm surprised you don't even have a suit on, because sometimes you do wear a suit.
It's like
I think you did last time.
LA.
That's true. That's true. So I have to say that since I have known you, we've known each other since 2008, and you have always been so prescient about just what's happening with culture and social media, with commerce. I mean, those are the things that you like to actually look at. Those are the trends that you're interested in. There are many startups here that are really young, really young. They're looking for their first, I guess, seed investment, many of them. And one of your deals was Snapchat, which you invested $485,000 into Snapchat when they were, what, maybe 10 months old? Not even that much.
I mean, it was just the two founders at the time. Yeah, they had, I think, order of magnitude, a few tens of thousands of users. Just
a few tens of thousands of users within that year?
At the time that we invested, yeah.
Okay. I mean, some of these startups here are probably trying to figure out, they have a mobile app, perhaps, and I'm sure it's different if you're fintech or if it's consumer, but is there a threshold? Is there a minimum number of users they should have before they even talk to you, before they can get a seed round?
I think that the environment has changed a lot. I mean, when we invested in Snapchat, we bought 10% of the company for $500,000, and they had a few tens of thousands of users. So seed pricing has, I think, moved upwards since then.
Sure.
And the amount of traction that you see from some seed companies has changed as well. I like, at Lightspeed we've got $3 billion under management. Our current fund family is about $1 billion. So for us, we actually have the ability to flex upwards or downwards depending on, frankly, the financing environments. So for us, that's less important. What we're most focused on, especially on the consumer side, is some evidence that that users are really responding positively. And so, for instance, for a social app, I look for a DAU to MAU ratio of at least 25–30%. I look for sessions per day.
Daily average user.
Daily average user divided by monthly average user. Frankly, what I'm looking for is apps that could be home screen apps, which means that they get used multiple times a day and multiple days a week. So a DAU to MAU ratio in that 25% and above means that it's being used at least a couple times a week.
And they can have those metrics pretty early on.
As long as, I think, once you get into the tens of thousands of daily active users, then you have a reasonably statistically significant sample set. And if you see the growth, if you see that sort of engagement, retention you probably aren't going to see yet, but engagement's a pretty good predictor of retention. And then you have a use case that you think could be reasonably widespread, then that's something that looks pretty interesting.
Do you think adoption of consumer mobile apps is binary, meaning either you have the traction, if you can't get the traction in the first 3 months, you're pretty much done? I mean, if it's a good app, you're going to get traction right away.
There's so many elements, especially on the consumer side, especially on the social side. There's so many elements to what can drive growth. Getting the app right, getting the product features right, getting the vision right is just one piece of it. Yeah. And then, with social apps, the community is part of the product. And so getting the right set of users to adopt the app is another piece. And that can sometimes take a little bit more time, even once the product is launched. Yeah. But then once you have that connection between the right set of users using the product that you've built, then these days you do see that word of mouth. You know, people are telling each other. It's not this manufactured virality that we used to see on the web, where it was all about invites and, you know, this flow of how many invitations could you send and what was the acceptance rate and what was the install rate. It's much more about people who are, you know, fully engaged in the app, like leaning over and showing it to their friends and saying, you've got to get this app. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think you do start to see, once you've got that phase, you do start to see that growth starting to happen in a pretty meaningful way. I mean, if you're not seeing 20, 30% month-on-month growth once you've hit that phase, then you aren't in that, you probably don't have full product market fit.
So you probably were attracted to the traction that Snapchat was getting versus, say, the vision, or maybe both, because the vision was, you know, disappearing images. Back in 2000, when did you invest? 2011, 2012?
We invested spring of 2012.
Okay, so
yeah.
Spring of 2012. I mean, that wasn't very common. So what was it about that vision?
So I think that the vision, the product was disappearing photos, but that wasn't the vision. Mm-hmm. You know, the vision was much more compelling.
And he had that vision.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, one of the things that Evan talked about, you know, even back then, and this, I think, is common knowledge now. People talk about, you know, the performance anxiety of being on Facebook, mm-hmm. right, and how it's sort of the highlight reel of your life. And you know, if something doesn't make you look the way you want to look, then you don't put it on Facebook. And so he was talking about that concept, you know, years ago. I think it was a very kind of interesting conversation, and he talked about how, you know, if you want to build relationships with people, you have to see 360 degrees of them. It can't be just their top 10% moments.
Right.
It can't be just when they're feeling happy or proud or you know, excited. It can't be their highlight reel, because real relationships get built around seeing people not just when they're happy and excited, but also when they're silly or goofy or sad or nervous or like that whole set of emotions is how people build relationships. And he said that wasn't happening on Facebook. And the reason it wasn't happening was because it was the journal of record mm-hmm. for your real life. And so everything you put up there stayed there. And so the ephemeral nature of what he was doing with Snapchat actually was driving people to be much more complete in their communications with their friends, because the communications are happening digitally. They are happening through their phones. And so being able to do that in a way that allowed people to see their whole friends was actually creating much stronger relationships between people, and that was the vision that got me excited.
Are you on Snapchat?
I am a little, but I mean, to be honest, you know, I'm in my mid-40s, and so you know, many of my friends and peers are not. And so you know, just like any other social service, and you have a messaging service, it's only as useful as the set of people that you communicate with through that. And so there are some people that I know that are heavier users, and I use it with them, but many of my friends are of my age, and they don't use it as much.
Right, right. I'm on Snapchat. My teenager said,
right.
Well, he said, what? What are you doing on Snapchat? You should be on Facebook. And so it's interesting. I wonder if there is, like you said, there is, do they graduate from Snapchat then?
I don't, well, we haven't seen evidence of that yet. Who knows what the future holds, but we haven't seen any evidence. In fact, what we've seen is growing adoption by more and more, you know, the base is growing, right? And in some respects, it has actually skipped a little bit in exactly the way that you're talking about, where, you know, the parents of teenagers and people in their, you know, early 20s are starting to use Snapchat because that's the way they communicate with
right.
their
kids are
children.
On it, yes,
right.
They should be on it.
And
too.
so they almost pop over
mm-hmm.
the sort of, you know, 30s and you know, and some early 40s whose kids might not be old enough to be using Snapchat yet. But then as they age into it, I think we'll start to fill that in.
Yeah. Well, I also want to talk later, because I don't want to focus too much on Snapchat. I want to focus on what you're LA trend spotting, how you're spotting trends. But I do want to, if we can talk about it a little later, talk about maybe the future of media, because Snapchat, as well as Whisper, the company, another company that you invested in, Michael Hayward was with us last year. it seems like they're redefining media. So we'll talk about that a little later. One quick question. You and I both have 3-year-olds. You talked about your home screen and maybe your mobile phone and trying to think about what's going to be on your mobile phone. Do you ever look at it and say, what's my 3-year-old going to be doing when my 3-year-old's 10 or 12? And do you ever think that way? And does that help you figure out what to invest in? Maybe 3-year-old's too young.
Yeah, 3-year-old's definitely too young. But I think that looking at people's home screens is actually one of the most useful ways to sort of figure out what's coming up. If you look at your home screen today, I mean, like just about every app that's on it is at least $1 billion company, it's because you get this sort of self-perpetuation that, like, I think the research says that the average person only uses something like 24, 25 apps per month. And there's only 28 spots on the home screen of an iPhone 6, right? So if you're hidden 2 screens back or in a subfolder or something like that, then you're not getting used in any meaningful way.
Do you have 24 apps like on your phone, and do you use those 24 apps on your home screen?
On the home screen?
Yeah.
I certainly have 28 apps on my home screen, and yeah.
I mean that you use.
Yeah. I mean, because you sort of, the ones that you don't use, you drag off because you find something you use more and you drag that on to your home screen. Otherwise, it's too much hassle to, like, swipe 3 screens back and to find something. What's
missing? Do you need a finance app? Do you need a health app? I'm saying this because I know there's a lot of finance. There's some fintechs and there's healthcare startups here, but do you need those type of apps? What's missing from your home screen that you're looking for?
I don't feel incomplete. my home screen works for me. But I mean, look, there's turnover in these things all the time, right? As you go through different phases of life, and there might be a point in time where when my children were really young, I was actually much more interested in, like, some of the content around babies and, like, what the kids should be doing at such and such an age and so forth. And then as they get older, that becomes less relevant. But for a while, that is a home screen app for me because it's something I use multiple times a day and multiple days a week.
Right.
So there's been some interesting companies started up in the kind of women's reproductive health area where those are apps where women are using them. Period trackers, Glow. There's a company that was, I forget the name, in Europe that was just recently financed that's the opposite of Glow, not trying to help you get pregnant, but trying to help you not get pregnant.
And the Honest Company just bought one last year, I believe.
That's exactly right. And so, these are these apps that have that potential, that are being used multiple times, maybe not multiple times, well, multiple times a week some of the time, and multiple times per day. And those are, when you get that sort of habituation, that's when you get real value creation.
So what about the Apple Watch? You're invested in Little Labs, which creates these apps for the Apple Watch. What have you learned? What's actually really important for that? Because that's a much smaller screen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Apple Watch has been incredibly successful on some dimensions and then not that successful on others. I mean, they've sold a lot of watches, which is great. But I think most people have been disappointed with the performance and the latency for apps on the phone, on the watch. I mean, it takes so long for an app to load that you may as well just reach into your pocket and pull out your phone in many instances. And so it's really become a notifications channel, and that's been really interesting. But it's probably a subset of what's possible with that device. And I think we're going to see more and more as the performance of those things get better and better.
Has Little Labs come out with an app already for the?
Yeah, so they've come out with a couple of games. Anytime you get a mass adopted consumer platform, you'll get games on it.
Yeah.
And so they came out with a game for The Martian, the movie that just came out. They had a casino game as well.
Just for the watch.
Just for the watch. That's right. Yeah. Okay. And so it requires a lot of thinking about what's the right user experience for such a constrained real estate device with essentially single tap as your only interaction tool. And so, for instance, The Martian is very much a story-driven, a narrative-driven game, which is a very different kind of gameplay that we haven't seen as much of. But we're pretty excited about it.
Anyone here building an app for the watch? Not really, not there yet. I guess if this were a mobile conference, that would be a little bit different.
Well, no, as I said before, I think there was a lot more excitement about what the Apple Watch could be until it launched, and like the performance just hasn't been that good. Like, it is a slow device.
Yeah, it could be very early on.
I think that's right, and the fact that consumers are adopting it suggests that there's demand for something like that, and I think as the capabilities of that device get better, we're going to see more and more. I mean, Apple has a history of getting the third iteration right.
Yeah, I mean, they came up with the Newton in 80-something, something like that, right? Does anybody even know the Apple Newton? I'm sure. You guys have to know the Apple Newton. You guys weren't born in the 80s? Some of you were.
Pre-Palm Pilot.
Yeah. So I want to read this. Somebody profiled you and said something very nice, very flattering, and they said that when Lightspeed invested in Snapchat and Whisper, most people assumed social startups peaked. But Liew, paraphrasing you, said, if you flip, or maybe you actually said this, if you flip Facebook's need for real IDs to anonymous accounts, then you get an app like Whisper. If you flip Facebook's needs for permanence to impermanence, you get Snapchat. Liew is on the hunt for under the radar, or I'd say out of favor trends like that. What is an under the radar trend today, or out of favor trend?
In this financing environment, nothing is out of favor. I mean, it really, it's, when I was making some of those investments in 2011, 2012, still the hangover of the 2008, 2009, there was a long period where people were like, I don't want to invest in anything. Facebook won, or on social, or whatever the conclusions were. I think we're in an environment where everything feels up for grabs. So I don't think that's as true anymore.
Okay.
I think that the pendulum always tends to swing too far. I think there's probably a little bit too much enthusiasm that everything is possible right now. There are some people who I think are going to be ending up tilting at windmills, and that pendulum will swing back around, and it's a great time to be an entrepreneur right now, because capital is readily available, and that means that you can follow your dreams, which is great.
It's probably a lot more competitive. So if there's all of these, everybody is just curious and creating these great new startups and products and services, that must mean that some of them are overdone. What do you see?
Well, I mean, so this is the wonderful thing. I mean, look, I have 6 investments in LA. I only have 1 in San Francisco, and I think the reason is that it used to be that like the technology early adopters were these sort of digerati, these kind of coastal elites that or West Coast San Francisco elites who were predicting the future because they were living in this future that no one else saw yet. Mm-hmm. And so you saw all of these consumer startups in San Francisco because they were building products for themselves. Today, where everybody's got a smartphone, where everybody's got broadband wireless internet, you don't have to start with early adopters and then slowly go to cross the chasm to the early majority and so on and so forth. Now you can go directly to the mass market with consumer products, and if you ask yourself, which one city has their finger on the pulse of popular culture better than any other city in America, it's probably LA. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's true. I think LA is the city that leads culture, that creates culture, mass market culture. I'm not talking, symphony hall type stuff. I'm talking about things that ordinary people spend their times doing. That is the legacy, that's the history of this city. And I think that's why you're seeing so many really interesting startups aimed at middle America that understand, where people want to be coming out of LA.
Yeah.
And that's Whisper, and that's Snapchat, and that's Honest Company. I mean, that's Dollar Shave Club, that's Just Fab and Shoe Dazzle. Like, there's on and on and on. None of these companies are like aimed at some elite. They're all aimed at mass market America because that's what this city knows so well.
That's an interesting way of looking at LA. How many, by the way, we have about 10 minutes left. If anyone here has a question, we do have mics. So we also want to make this interactive. So if anybody has a question for Jeremy, please just raise your hand. And so I'm sure a lot of people want to know, I know why, but you should probably let people know why, if you're so invested in LA, why you're not down in LA. You're here once a month, once every 2 weeks or so?
I'm here, once or twice a month. My wife likes living in San Francisco, and I like living with my wife. So
that's a good thing. Yes. Good answer. Right over there.
Hi, I'd love to get your thoughts on ad tech and the consolidation from a VC perspective. Do you see companies, VCs not wanting to invest in ad tech anymore and moving to e-commerce and fintech? Is that bubble, has that burst?
I think you said, do you see anyone investing, is there interest in advertising technology companies?
Yeah.
Do you see more interest in commerce and other
fintech.
areas? So is ad tech attractive?
I haven't done much investing in ad tech. It's not an area that I'm an expert in, but I think that your observation is correct, that it's a little bit out of favor. And these things are all, it's like they come in, everything comes in and out of fashion, right? E-commerce, until a few years ago, you couldn't find very many people who wanted to invest in e-commerce. The conventional wisdom was you can't get an exit more than $500 or $600 million. There hadn't been $1 billion e-commerce exit in 10 years. It's operationally intensive, it's low margin, and it requires a lot of capital to scale. And then you had these companies come along to totally disprove that, right? You saw Zulily and you saw Wayfair, bootstrapping themselves, on less than $5 million of capital, getting to revenue in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and then having billion-dollar type exits. And then you saw, all these companies coming up behind them, whether it be an Ipsy or a Honest or a Dollar Shave Club, getting again on like relatively low capital to hundreds of millions of dollars of scale, and that changes the conventional wisdom. I think with ad tech, you have a little bit of that dynamic where people are looking back and saying, where are the exits over $600 million? Hey, this is a business where margins tend to get compressed over time. And so yeah, I think right now it's a little bit out of favor, just as e-commerce was 3 years ago, just as content was for like 10 years, and now you've got the BuzzFeeds and the Vices and the and the Mikes and the Bustles of the world, and the all coming up behind. So there is fashion, and fashions come in and out. And right now, I would say that ad tech is a little bit out of fashion. But that doesn't mean that it's fundamentally not a good idea. It just means that there may not be appetite as much today.
That's a good opportunity, right? When ad tech's out of favor, it's a good opportunity.
I think that's broadly true. Whenever something is out of favor, it means there's less competition, and so if you are successful, then you can be much more successful. But you still have to solve the financing. You still got to get someone else to believe.
Hi. So you mentioned that Apple kind of came out a little bit prematurely in terms of how optimal the product could have been. So my question is around, should a product company sacrifice quality over timing to market? And what's the risk there? Because I think Apple was a little bit under pressure by Pebble time at the time, where they had already raised $13 million on Kickstarter. So, what would you recommend to get to market faster with a product that's suboptimal, or wait until you get it absolutely perfect and right, and then iterate, or what would you suggest there?
There's no perfect answer to that question, but I think a lot of it depends on how quickly you can iterate. So the faster your ability to iterate, the easier it is to go to market with something that isn't quite right. If your iteration cycles are slow, then you don't get as many shots on goal to correct things. Hardware has long iteration cycles. Software and apps have slightly shorter, and then the web has the shortest, right? And so what you saw on the web is a lot of people just launching and then, watching user behavior and quickly changing like the focus of their company and the key, a lot of it would change based on observing what was resonating with users and then directing their product development towards that. It was less driven by product vision and more driven by kind of analytics. In the smartphone app world, I think you've seen a much more of a move towards a vision-driven approach because it's much slower and harder to iterate your app. You've got certain cycles around App Store acceptance and so forth, and that means that you can't push daily or hourly if you wanted to. It takes weeks. And then hardware, the cycles are even longer, and so it's more important that you've got a product that's resonating with a core user base at the moment of launch.
Okay, time's up, but I do want to take a moment to ask Jeremy one last question because he's such an astute observer of media and an investor in Snapchat and Whisper, and I believe both are actually changing the media landscape. Jeremy recently retweeted a tweet from Stephen Colbert that said, more 18 and 24-year-olds followed the Republican debate on Snapchat than CNN or Fox News. What does that say about the future of media, and what does Whisper and Snapchat look like? Give me your vision of Snapchat and Whisper in sort of the media landscape.
Sure. I mean, look, you have a 13-year-old, right? Where does he spend his time? Phones and feeds, right? And that is where people are spending their time. So you've got to build media companies that meet people where they are, right? There's this concept of omni-channel in retail, right? Everybody's moving towards omni-channel. So the Gap used to be all stores, and then it started catalogs, and it went to the web. Bonobo started just on the web, right? And it has opened up physical stores, and it's doing catalogs as well. You've got to meet your customers where they are. And so I think the same thing is happening in the media environment. And you look at Vice, right? They started out as a magazine, then they became predominantly web, and a little bit of mobile, and now they're starting TV, right? BuzzFeed, which started on the web and then has moved to mobile and actually has made a nice transition to an app, is doing a lot more video as well. And so, wherever you are, wherever you start, you've got to go meet your users where they are. And right now, if you're going to target millennials, they're in their phones and their feeds, and they're not reading magazines, and they're not watching TV. If it's video, it's got to be mobile video. And so that, I think, is kind of, if you're going to target the millennial audience,
sure,
you got to be where they are, and that's, I think, how that stuff is playing out. And I think that's going to be a really difficult transition for a lot of the traditional media companies, in large part because, I mean, you think about MTV. MTV was started aimed at 20-somethings when the founder was a 20-something, right? And now that guy is a 60-something. And so he doesn't have the same like intuitive understanding of what it is. Like he's trying to study it by watching it, whereas the founders of Snapchat, the founders of Whisper, the founders of Mike, they are all millennials, and they intuitively are building products for themselves. That's a way easier thing to do in a vision-driven environment, which is what we are in right now.
And so what it sounds like what you're saying is they're going to drive that vision of what new media is going to look like.
I think so. I mean, look, an area that I'm spending a lot of time in right now is mobile video, right? And we have started to see what natively mobile video is just in the last few years. First go around was just trying to port from the web, but now we're understanding the form, the vertical viewing is, the form factor is different, the cuts are different, the pacing is different. You can't assume that you've got volume on. And so like all of these things are starting to, and so yeah, like that's because they viscerally understand it because they're consumers of the product.
Okay. Is there a future for Twitter?
I think so.
Okay.
Absolutely.
It's below its IPO price. Just curious.
You know what? I think people's focus, you know, because we're early stage investors, we focus on the value that was created from the founding of the company, not from the time of the IPO. And, you know, Twitter, Pure, Zynga, Groupon, all these, you know, Zynga and Groupon, two companies that I think are regarded as having underperformed because they're, you know, well below their IPO price. You know, I would reframe it and say, listen, that's a company that's a $4 billion company or a $2 billion company that's only 6 years old. Like, how can that be a failure? Like, jobs and enterprise value and happy customers were created.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying they're failures. I was just curious if it was going, Twitter would be replaced by Snapchat and Whisper. Anyway, time is definitely up. I monopolized this stage with you. But thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thank
and
you.
Jeremy will be around. Oh, let me get